Hello, everyone. Well, it's an honour and a privilege to be part of this panelist day. I'm Nick Fox from the British Sociological Association's Applied Sociology group, so the other side of the world. And I'm really pleased to be part of this panelist day. And I just want to tell you in this presentation a bit about what we've been doing in the Applied Sociology group, the ASG, and particularly about a couple of initiatives to enhance sociological input to practice and policy settings. So I'll explain a bit more about the group and mention some of our activities, including the curriculum in applied sociology. I'll then talk about an event earlier this year which brought together sociologists and public health professionals, and then a project in which two of my young colleagues at the University of Huddersfield, which is where I have a part-time job, have been seconded to a local council. So the Applied Sociology group was established about 16 years ago, and it was originally called Sociologists Outside Academia. It was originally a support group for sociologists who didn't work in universities. And that's how I got involved, because I left my full-time job at the University of Sheffield in 2009 and suddenly wanted to become an independent scholar. And I thought, okay, I'll join this group called the Sociologists Outside Academia. And then within about a month, then the convener resigned. And I thought, oh, well, no one else wants to do it. Maybe I should be the convener. So that's how I became one of the conveners in about 2010. But since then, the focus of the group has changed towards promoting applied sociology as a career option for the majority of sociology graduates who do not go into academia or even do a master's or a PhD. The group is free to join by anyone. It's actually open to any sociologist, not just PSA members, so it's very inclusive. I'm just checking that the slides are actually doing that, because I've got my script on here, not my slides. So this is the definition of applied sociology that our group is working towards. You can read that for yourself. And our objective is to promote sociology as a viable career outside academic settings, in the same way that psychologists or economists can work in a variety of non-academic settings, using sociological subject knowledge and insights rather than trying to find work that merely uses some of the soft skills that you pick up along the way during an undergraduate sociology degree. So to support this aim, we came up with this definition. Sorry, I just flipped over a bit too early. So, yeah, sorry, there we go. This definition of applied sociology you can probably tell was written by a committee because it's rather long-winded, but it differentiates applied sociology both from academic sociology and from public sociology, though the latter is also part of what we see as this problem orientation of applied sociology. So the applied sociology curriculum was initiated in 2017 as a project which was aimed to become a resource which we could provide to university sociology degree course leads and to offer a framework and indicative learning outcomes appropriate for final year undergraduates. It didn't identify specific teaching sessions, but does suggest learning and assessment approaches, and it can form the basis for a final year unit of study or potentially for an entire master's degree. It was launched at the BSA conference in April 2018, and since then we've offered it free to UK sociology departments and to others by arrangement. And it has been picked up very substantially in the UK, and that's very exciting. And we've worked with a number of universities to help them to develop their applied sociology teaching. Oops. So going on to some of the other initiatives, we've, in addition to the curriculum, what we've sought to do is to enhance the supply side of UK applied sociology, to create a cadre of sociology graduates who have the capacities to work as applied sociologists in public or private sectors. We've put on events over the past few years to reach out to students and graduates. We offer a blog on our website, and most recently podcasts with more case studies and discussions of applied sociology. However, what I want to really focus on now is to turn efforts towards the demand side of the equation, as there is little point of developing an army of applied sociologists without also showing potential employers the benefits of having sociologists in the office. So the first of these initiatives happened earlier this year, and in April 2020, my colleague at the University of Sheffield, Katie Powell, and I ran a workshop which aimed to bring together public health and sociologists in the Yorkshire region of the UK to discuss how to enhance sociological input into public health. And it was one of the first face-to-face events after the pandemic had receded, and so it was really a joyous occasion for that alone. It was a fantastic day. We have academics, public health professionals, postgraduate students from various local universities attending. The workshop included some short talks, then a series of breakout activities which explored the issues over translating sociology to practice settings, and indeed the kinds of public health activities which might be ripe for sociological input. We talked a lot about boundary objects, and also about the challenges of applying critical social theory to a discipline, in other words, public health, that can be quite biomedical in its outlook on health. So these are the questions we sought to address, and I'll let you just read these for yourself for a moment. So this slide shows some of the findings from the workshop. What emerged was first the need to raise the profile of sociology as a discipline that could be useful to public health practitioners, maybe using case studies, blogs, other means to actually explain to public health people what sociology actually is and what it does. There was also a suggestion of support for follow-up activities, including joint training on using sociological methods and concepts. However, it was also recognized that when sociologists work in applied public health settings, they need ongoing support, and the establishment of a network for sociologists in public health will be a good first step in that direction. So that leads me on, those sorts of conclusions from that work that day, and now the work which we're starting to do to follow up on that, leads quite neatly onto another initiative that I want to share with you today, which I think suggests a very interesting model for doing applied sociology, which is somewhat different from what we heard about the consultancy approach in the plenary this morning, which was absolutely fantastic and really inspiring to hear. So I've called it Embedding Sociology. And actually at that workshop in April around sociology and public health, one of the sessions was run by two young colleagues of mine. I'll call them Alice and Jane at the University of Huddersfield. And they're currently seconded for 2 years to a local council, a local authority. And since then, I've been working with these two sociology graduates, providing some support in terms of mentoring, though they have more formal line management within the university as well. But interestingly, they've been employed at the council, not as sociologists, but as information analysts. Maybe it's less threatening to the council to have that kind of title. They're working on a range of projects, which I'm going to outline in the next slide. And these projects will in due course report to relevant council departments as the findings become apparent. So these are the projects that are undertaken, that are currently being undertaken by Alice and Jane. You can see from that that they're actually quite diverse. The first of these projects involves recommendations for revisions to a tool which is used widely in the UK by councils, by voluntary organisations and other bodies. The Place Standard tool, which I have to say I've never heard of, is basically a questionnaire that can be used to structure conversations with individuals or groups about specific places, physical places, and how aspects of that place can affect health or well-being. So the council had concerns about how this should be applied in practice. So Alice and Jane have brought to bear their sociological understanding of research methodologies to make recommendations about how the Place Standard tool can be revised. Well, the second project, they said, was quite a challenge, addressing how social housing could be more equitably allocated by the council. Alice and Jane told me they felt that it was a roller coaster working on that project, as they had no prior knowledge whatsoever of housing inequalities. They've analysed the data on housing applications for the past few years, massive amounts of quantitative data which has been available. But they also shadowed council staff as they made allocation decisions and observed the housing team members in action. Well, they found that allocations depended largely upon the number of bedrooms that a family required in order to be housed, with larger properties in short supply. But this had an unintended consequence of reducing capacity to house some ethnic minority applicants who tend to have larger families. And they realized as a consequence that this was hugely political, as if one might not have imagined that already. And the final project they're working on currently is looking at special educational needs. And this involved documentary analysis of data collected by the council's education team on educational outcomes at different ages of children, right from 5 through to adult. And what has emerged from that is a very strong link between having special educational needs and poverty, which interestingly had not been previously identified by the housing team, which again, as sociologists, we would think, wow, that's kind of obvious, really. So these are some of the issues which I think have emerged out of that embedding sociologist approach. First, unlike outside researchers, because they became employees of the council, in effect, Alice and Tracy have had really good access to data and to council staff as they work on their various projects, which you wouldn't get if you were an outside consultant necessarily. There would be all sorts of issues about information security and anxiety about having outsiders actually potentially whistleblowing on what's going on. Secondly, being dropped into a new work environment requires a very steep learning curve, especially for a young sociology graduate such as Alice or for Jane, who neither of them have PhDs. One of them is actually working at the moment towards a PhD, but they don't have very much research experience. Next, Alice and Jane said it was very hard to sustain the political neutrality required of council officers coming from the critical tradition of sociology. And that's something which is also picked up at that workshop I was telling you about earlier. Fourth, that secondment like this can be quite isolating. And it's important to make sure that good support exists in the secondment, both in the secondment and in the parent university. Fifth, that Alice and Jane said that a 2-year secondment was too short. The first few months for them was taken up by learning the ropes and building relationships with council staff. And that's also possibly partly due to their inexperience, relative inexperience. If you were more senior, you might just basically go in there and you be able to do it more quickly. And finally, the funding of schemes such as this secondment is very precarious, and I think it was actually obtained through a particular grant that university obtained. So with both councils and universities short of cash, there's a problem here. So this is my last slide then. My conclusions. The two initiatives I talked about today flag up some more general points. They support the view that underpins the applied sociology group that sociological knowledge, theories, and skills are valuable assets in many work sectors. At the same time, doing applied sociology is quite different from academic research. Unlike the emphasis in academia on outputs, citations, and so on, in an applied setting, it's all about impact on practice or policy, and writing papers is a low priority. But I suggest that embedding sociologists in organizations such as councils, charities, or even private companies is a way to demonstrate the utility of sociology beyond academic settings. So there's a message here for sociology departments too. They need to think creatively about how to increase opportunities to enable graduates to use their sociological knowledge in careers beyond academic research or teaching, through things like these placements or strategic secondments. They also need to equip graduates with the skills to adapt sociological knowledge, concepts, and theories to applied settings. Thank you so much for listening to me today.
Hi everyone, can you hear me okay? So my name is Sienna Aguilar, my pronouns are she, her, and first of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land which we're all meeting on today and pay respects to elders past, present, and any First Nations people in the room today. Some of us were at a women's breakfast this morning, and Carol, thanks for coming along today, because I think as sociologists, when we think about what we value as knowledge in our Western institutions, how can we think about our role in decolonizing what we're doing? It's really important. And how do we amplify knowledges in the work that we do in academia as well as in applied settings? And so what I'm going to talk to you about today, sort of, I guess, an applied example of people who study sociology and then take very different paths. So yes, I'll tell you a little bit about myself and a couple of the things that I've been involved in and how I've applied sociology in my career, and in particularly looking at a systems thinking framework called social ecology as a way of thinking and being that's really influenced, shaped how I make sense of the world and the issues that I'm really passionate about, because I actually had a different role when I applied for this panel. I'm going to be taking a slightly different take and look at how I'm looking to apply sociology and social ecology within the context of women's health and advocacy. So for myself, I did a Bachelor of Music specializing in jazz voice, so a bit of a different route, but I like to think that the complexities of different areas has actually led me into this winding path into sociology, and I discovered social science and sociology as part of that unexpectedly. And after that, doing some different postgraduate studies, I ended up working predominantly in applied settings, in not-for-profit community organizations, for example, developing outcomes evaluation frameworks and tools in child, family, and community services. I grew up on Ngunnawal land in Canberra. I did some program development in the primary prevention of gender-based violence. And also, and that path sort of took me on over the last 10 years, a clear focus on advocacy around gender equality and gender equity, personally and professionally. So these wicked problems in the world, how do we make sense of them? For myself, sociology really brought that critical lens to understand the social issues impacting different groups personally, within groups, and across the different communities that we were supporting. So the picture in the middle was a workshop with young feminists doing a project on sexual reproductive health. And how they were using their voice to enact social change. And the picture on the right was at a government consultation on addressing violence against women. And And I think I hadn't necessarily identified as an applied sociologist at the time, but in some of the things that, for example, that Nick had mentioned, the skills and how you actually apply the thinking and critical skills to practical issues is something that I'm really interested in, and particularly not just at a program or programmatic level, but also what are the systemic levers that we need to shift or that we can pull, and how can the people in this room really influence the public discourse and policies. So on that note, in this year I graduated with a Master of Education in Social Ecology at Western Sydney Uni. Has anyone heard of the term social ecology before? Great. So yeah, so it was an interesting place where it was in the School of Education, but really it ended up being quite a transformative and quite interdisciplinary experience, and was quite experiential. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And while it was the only course in the Southern Hemisphere of its kind and was unfortunately discontinued in our current context, it certainly has been a transformative experience and really shaped my way of thinking, being, and doing. So social ecology basically explores the interrelationships between individuals, the social world, and the physical environment. So just as ecology is a branch of biology that deals with the relationships of organisms to one another and its physical surroundings, social ecology really looks at how we relate to ourselves, how we relate to each other, and our natural environment. So it draws a lot from systems thinking, which views that existence of phenomena, whether it's cells, organisms, humans, or organizations, within the context of a larger whole. So thinkers such as Capra and Luisi move away from compartmentalizing a property, whether it's a person or our bodies or organisms, rather than investigating it in and of itself. Systems thinking explores those properties as nodes that exist alongside other nodes within a whole network. And really, because it draws as well from living systems, it also talks a lot about the diversity. So how is it that we exist in systems, and how do we influence each other within those systems? So the idea of interconnections and interdependence is really important as well. Because we know that as sociologists, that nothing is cut and dry, that there is complexity in everything. And as our keynote speaker said today, a lot of it was about sense making. And I think for me, social ecology was this way of thinking and being that actually we make sense of the world, not just in our brains, but actually in our bodies as well, and how we relate to our, how I'm relating to you right now, there's data in that as well, in these interactions. And then what do we do with that? The so what is the piece after that. So Stuart Hill, a prominent social ecologist from Australia, defines social ecology as the study and practice of personal, social, and ecological sustainability and progressive change based on the critical application and integration of ecological, humanistic, community, and also spiritual values. So in this way, it's inherently political and recognizes the power dynamics in all of our relationships, in our behaviors and actions. So a lot of people who have delved into social ecology, there's a strong sort of environmental consciousness, a lot of I guess drawing on indigenous knowledges that is not linear, that is circular. And also in this way, it highlights the need for healing across personal, social, environmental domains. So for example, Rifkin draws on the links with the exploitation of the natural environment, as we all know, whether it's the domestication and domination of animals, to linking that with technological innovations and the introduction of capitalist systems. So we know that the knowledge that we're generating, interestingly, depending on who you're working for, how do you remain politically neutral? It depends, but social ecology really talks about actually we as researchers are not neutral, and we're actors within the systems that we operate in. And so yes, so what's our duty in terms of stimulating action for better care for each other, the natural world, for our communities, and so on. So on that note, what I wanted to focus on is because social ecology has also been used in public health settings, for example, explaining individual behaviors within broader social contexts. And so it's been used for like targeted health promotion, health literacy, and other programs for preventative health. And it's also influenced policy frameworks and evidence building in Australia, for example, around the prevention of violence against women. So a lot of that in terms of awareness raising campaigns or changing attitudes and behaviors, that doesn't happen in isolation. How are individuals influenced and influence each other, and how does that in turn influence the organizations, workplaces, and societies that we live in? So I'm going to talk specifically around women's health because I've just started a role as Senior Project Officer at the Australian Women's Health Network. So it's a very small national peak body, and its vision is around health equity for all women. And our vision, purpose, and guiding principles are inclusive of cis women, trans, feminine, identifying, and non-binary people, and really wanting to be a collective voice around women's health, which in and of itself, again, we recognize that we're also not a homogenous group either, and that there's complexity within and across populations. So because of that, we aim to provide a gender equity lens on healthcare and research, understanding the social, cultural, and environmental and political nature of women's health, which isn't a surprise to people in this room, but also taking that one step further in terms of impact, being a vehicle for women's health organizations, consumers, and advocates to collect and collaborate. Even just one tiny example, like I was able to come here today on a bursary because as a small not-for-profit, there wasn't actually any budget for travel. And one of the things that we're really looking at is how do we make evidence, the evidence base and emerging evidence to influence our systems and policies. How do we make that accessible? So to the nurse who's trying to advocate for something in her practice or their practice, to people who are in government, even the fact that I have a university library access, like that kind of privilege is something that not everyone who works in women's health or in the broader health ecosystem has. And so that's something that I'd also love to kind of hear. How can we as universities and academics and people working in this space, actually, how do we make our work more accessible as well? So this particular project is really looking at working with our members to define, and anyone who cares about women's health, define what effective prevention looks like across different thematic areas of women's health and population. Through this, one also develops women's health policy, resources in response to identified areas of need. And then in terms of that accessibility of knowledge, banking resources with broader women's health knowledge on a refreshed women's health hub. So there used to be a women's health hub that had a lot of knowledge since the 80s, some progressive work that had been done. How do we actually build on the legacy of work that's been done before and also into the future? And so then evidence and training, using that knowledge and actually supporting health advocates, practitioners, governments, funders, and others to embed a gender equity lens through our prevention work. Just really quickly, at the sort of institutional system level of change and action, this project sits under the National Preventive Health Strategy, and there's also a National Women's Health Strategy. So if you had a look at them, I'm sure you'd be able to see where your work intersects with it, or people in your circles. But the idea is really that if we can amplify the voices of our members and people in community to look at what works well in prevention, how can that then align with the sort of national picture, and then the policies that follow. In terms of the principles that guide the project, these are some of them here, and I won't go into all of them, but just thinking again about the knowledge generation and advocacy that doesn't happen in a vacuum, but really applying that system thinking, a population approach. So recognizing that, again, I don't need to explain it in this room in terms of how inequities and health outcomes are disproportionate across our communities. But also, I guess the main one that I wanted to highlight was in terms of using a social model of health, as I mentioned, to examine the social, cultural, political, and ecological factors which contribute to the health of women intergenerationally, as well as within and across populations. I think I did also, yeah. So just touching on, I'll leave that up for a moment in terms of the population approach, and even in the language of communicating things, one of my areas of interest is how do I communicate in a way that can be understood in a room like this, in a community with health workers, etc. And again, who are we engaging? A broader health ecosystem across think tanks and academic institutions such as yourself, to everyone who plays a role. So again, thinking about what are the different roles that people play, at what levels can we engage, draw on knowledge and share and build back. So in summary, I've really been drawn to systems thinking and social ecology as a way to better understand and address complex issues. And that's something that I'll be looking at this project. It's about 2.5 years. And we're actually going to be engaging people, if you're interested in learning more about it. Get in touch, because I think seeing the connectivity between those elements that create those complex problems is exactly why we're here, and how we can use that towards effective prevention. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Catherine. I'm currently working at Macquarie University in the School of Law as a sociologist. But prior to doing my PhD, I was a consultant, and I did applied social research of all sorts of different kinds and quite a lot of evaluation. And what I wanted to talk about today is the central and really liberating role that I find being deeply connected to a philosophy of science and different social theories is for my work, even though I'm doing applied work. I think sometimes in different applied settings, you don't necessarily see the work that social theory and meta theory is doing behind the scenes when sociologists are involved. And I think this is, I can't remember if it was you this morning, Sam, that said it, or someone else, but it's something about the superpower that we have, that we bring this to the table. So what I'm talking about today is primarily a philosophy of science. It's called critical realism. Although I will talk about critical realism and its role in my work, I'm not here evangelizing critical realism per se, but what I would really like to show is the role that having an understanding of what your philosophical drivers are, what role it can play in applied work, the role of theory and meta theory in how we understand the nature of the world and how important it is that we know how we understand what the world is, what we think the world is like, and how we get knowledge of it, that these things actually have very practical ramifications in our research work. And particularly, for me, in terms of what does causality really look like? How do we think in terms of the causality of the real world? What is truth, in inverted commas? Like, what is our knowledge? And thirdly, the role that values and ethics play in our research. I am absolutely, and have never really been a positivist. I've always struggled with this idea that you could separate facts and values. And so this was one of the things that meant that I found a home in critical realism because of its perspective on that question, for example. What happened to the thank you. Skipped. It doesn't matter. The first slide seems to be gone. So in terms of today's talk, it's very much a personal reflection. My sociological research, I would say, is motivated by concerns of about social justice and about inequality. Therefore, I'm always challenged to understand the nature of wicked social problems, how they manifest, when, for whom, in what contexts. And secondly, to make what I think is a very important shift from describing things to actually explaining how they occur, the causal explanation that explains why they exist, and to move then to a practical next step for what might the positive interventions be. So critical realism is, as I've sort of said already, it's a meta theory, it's a philosophy of science. So it's really speaking to what is the nature of the world, how do we get knowledge of it, and how do we think about ethics and values. So it's a set of beliefs, which is important to state. I mean, this is my belief system, and not everybody will have the same one. But as I said at the beginning, I think it's really important to understand what our presuppositions are about ontology, the nature of the world, epistemology, how we come to know it, and axiology, so the way we think about values. And the importance for me is that these ideas have more and more become foundational frameworks for the work that I do, and I believe really empowered me to do better work, which is why I'm here speaking to you about it today. So I'm going to speak very briefly about the pillars of critical realism, some implications in applied social science research, and a couple of examples about how they've helped me come to different kinds of explanations to maybe what I would have done otherwise. So that was slide one. There you go. That's what's 4 pillars. These are going to be necessarily very brief. The most important thing to know about the ontology, or the beliefs about the nature of the world of critical realism, is that the world exists regardless of whether we see it or experience it. Things happen because of the reality of the world, even if we don't understand it, or even if we don't actually engage with it at that moment in time, for example. So what we see at the empirical, as Roy Bhaskar is one of the main thinkers in critical realism, what we see at the empirical level, all our observations, our experiences, are only a subset of all of the things that actually happen, some of which are observable but we haven't seen, others of which are unobservable. And what is causing all those things to happen is the causal mechanisms and powers embedded in structures at the level of the real, which we cannot see directly. So the most important implication of this is that what we see in our data, what we see in our observations, is not everything. We're not seeing the full patterns, but we're also needing to theoretically infer why they're happening, in what contexts, and the causal mechanisms that are interacting contingently in order for those things to happen. In terms of epistemology, or how we come to know things, in critical realism, there is still a belief, however, that all of our knowledge is going to be historically, socially constructed. So we will come to our knowledges depending on our own experiences, our place in the world, all of the influences that we've had over our lifetimes. And we will change how we understand things over time as we receive new information, and that we will receive it differently depending on the lenses that we employ. So there's this very important understanding of knowledge that, that critical realism has. What that then implies, of course, is that we need to be able to make judgments between different accounts of the world. And in critical realism, Bhaskar talks about judgmental rationality. I really like this term because the judgmental part of it acknowledges that our responses to things are going to be subjective. But the rationality part of it acknowledges that we're going to bring our disciplinary knowledge, for example, to thinking about whether or not an account is a good one or which account is better. We're going to bring our rationality. We're going to bring the cognitive processes that are part of who we are as people to making those evaluative judgments. And the final thing is a sort of cautious ethical naturalism. Bhaskar talks about ethical naturalism, so that ethics are real, they are there to be discovered, and what we believe about ethics is our relativistic knowledge. This is something which I'm not going to talk about too much now, except to say that the implications are that the fact-value distinction is impossible, that facts will always be mutated and changed by our values, and that our values will be developed on the basis of the facts, the things that we learn about the world and learn about each other and our relationships, and however it is that we're accumulating knowledge, that the facts and values will work together and can't be separated. And therefore, key implication, that social science is therefore given permission to try to tell us something about what the good life looks like. What does good society look like? What are the conditions under which humans may flourish? And that this value orientation to research is acceptable. And I think sometimes, depending on what backgrounds we've had and what our influences have been, this sense of needing to always be objective in order to say something about our research or our findings. And critical realism basically says we can't do that. What you really need to be doing is being very reflexive and very transparent and very acknowledging of other people's perspectives and knowledge viewpoints when you are doing work. So in terms of implications, I've already mentioned this a little bit. A primary implication is, how do you think about causality? When I first started working as an evaluation consultant, I was very much trained in a sort of program logic of, if X, then we expect Y to happen. So we're looking for these very linear causal patterns, and we're assessing whether or not those things are happening. It didn't really sit beautifully with me, because I could see in my experience of the world that causality was much more contextual, much more complicated. It would work for some people and not for others, this intervention. Why was that? It was very hard to get to in this more linear, slightly positivist understanding of causality. So for me, critical realism, with its acknowledgement that there's a stratification of reality, things that happen at a lower level emerge to be something new at a higher level. So, for example, when you talk about humans or people and social structures, there's a way of thinking about them as being distinct. Humans have a different nature, different kinds of causal properties or causal mechanisms to social structures, but they're inextricably linked to each other, and the social structures couldn't exist without the people. So there's something about this emergence and idea that when you talk about the social world, you're talking about different kinds of social structures at different layers of reality, some of which are maybe closer to psychology or closer to aspects of the natural sciences, like how our chemical or biological processes work, through to psychology and how our cognitive processes work, the things that happen at the individual level, all the way up to social structures. What it also means, as I said before, is that causal explanation is not just about describing what we see, but explaining it. So theorizing to what must be happening, what must be there in terms of mechanisms and structures to explain what it is that we see, and working towards the best causal explanations we can through that process of theorizing. And there's a lot in critical realism about different ways of doing that, I guess. A second really important thing is that because of this idea of a stratified reality, that if you're thinking, for example, about homelessness, you're going to be thinking about big social structures in terms of the welfare state, for example, or the housing market, but you're also going to be thinking about normative or cultural structures. You're going to be thinking about what happens to individuals, how they respond to what happens, how they process the influence of structures. So you're getting down into the psychological level. If you're also talking about the interactions of, for example, I'm really simplifying this, but mental health with homelessness, you're potentially also going to be looking further to what are the things that are happening at a chemical level or a biological level that are then emerging into people's psychological capacities, their cognitive capacities, and how all of these things are then over the different strata intersecting, interrelating with each other. The implication of that is different disciplines have different lenses for looking at different parts of this social structure. And I think as sociologists, if we think in these very stratified ways about the nature of social reality, we can do a lot of interpretation of what we find in different disciplines back into a central framework that enables us to explain things better than perhaps one discipline on its own can do. And there's something about sociology, I think, that places us to do that really well. The third point is structure and agency, which I've already touched on a little bit. There's obviously a huge history in big sociological theory about trying to understand the relationship between social structures and human agency. I think that because of stratification and because of emergence, there's a lot in critical realism that I've found to be incredibly useful conceptual tools for integrating structure and agency. Once again, in homelessness, you tend to get literature that talks about all the behaviours of the individual and how those behaviours have brought about someone's homelessness, or you tend to get big structural explanations that talk about the housing market or talk about welfare state. What is very rare in homelessness literature is explanations that integrate the two. And I guess what I'm suggesting here is that if you're interested in that relationship between structure and agency and how you need to include both in an integrated way in an explanation of a phenomenon, which then allows you to turn to creating change, then this is a really helpful framework. And the final slide here is, if I think about my work, these are the kinds of questions which I'm struggling with often. What is the problem? What generates it? How is that generation differentiated? So for who, why, in what contexts? And what can be done to alleviate the problem? And there's a number of concepts in critical realism which I have found really supportive for thinking about my work in terms of emancipation, so emancipatory social change. That our work is built on normative foundations, that there is no way of avoiding that, and that that's okay. And that what we do is really about diagnosis and critique, often of ideologies that are false, that are unhelpful, that are not creating a context where everybody has the opportunity to flourish. Thirdly, that we envisage what the future can be, what change could look like, in a way that is also acknowledging that there are constraints, but there are also resources that we can bring to bear, and that concrete utopias are utopias that are actually possible because we've been cognizant of those constraints and enablers. And finally, that in the same way that we need to theorise explanation, we need to theorise transformation, so theories of transformation. And the role of theory is as much in how we explain as how we establish theories of transformation. And that it's once again moving beyond description to use theory to think about how we can make change, what points of intervention need to be at what parts of the cycle of complexity that we want to intervene in. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. I'd like to start by acknowledging country, paying respects on Wurundjeri land nation, and pay respects to elders past and present. Putting together this panel today with the Applied Sociology group, what we really wanted to do was kind of set the scene for applied sociologists as a viable career option, and then give you a bit of a tasting of the breadth of ways to do that. So Catherine, Sienna and I have all got, or are presenting today, very different methodological, epistemological approaches, but have this shared common goal for using it for something to happen and to change, for a positive social change. And I love that because it's how society is. Not everyone thinks the same, not everything does the things the same, but having different tools in your toolbox means that when you're faced with a challenge in your workplace, you can kind of see and play and tinker and draw on these, sociological imagination things to try and actually get to these really tricky problems and see if there's a better way. So I was born and raised and lived most of my life on the agricultural country in Brisbane. And I now live up in the beautiful mountains on the Sunshine Coast in Ginnerborough country, so southeast Queensland. And the majority of my work, so today I want to give a quick overview of my day job and kind of the real life problems that came out of me doing this research, that I found certain methods weren't meeting all the needs that I was finding were really important to do. So to do that, I have to explain a little bit about participatory action research. So I also took this as your sociologists and fellow nerds. So I never work with sociologists. It's usually in hospitals and healthcare professionals and Aboriginal community control organisations community. So it's kind of fun to just be a nerd on methods. Disclaimer. To give you an overview of institutional ethnography, because it's not very well known in Australia, and I didn't want to assume that you did have knowledge, because it's a bit different and tricky to get your head around. It was for me. And compare it with participatory institutional ethnography, then compare those, but then focus on how this might be useful in governance structures. So particularly when we're talking about things like consumer engagement and co-design, but as an actual embedded mechanism for change in institutions. And some links if it's interesting. So my day job, for the last 7 years, I've been working in applied health service research. So working with hospitals and Aboriginal community control organisations to redesign maternity birthing services for First Nations families. And I get to work with really awesome people doing really awesome work. And we use participatory action research. So if you're not familiar, you bring all the stakeholders together that have a stake in it, whether that's families, organizations, staff. You plot and plan together, what are the issues, what might you want to do to change, and you basically come up with a plan for what you can do. And then you do it. That's different for a lot of professional sociology. But then you reflect on it and go, oh, well, that didn't go as we thought it did. Or, oh, wow, that's really cool. Didn't realize that would happen. And then you kind of get stuck in this cycle of, say, quality improvement on steroids. So it's highly fun, engaging, rewarding, because you're seeing the change as it happens, but also importantly, you're involving the people that the change concerns in the solutions, and it's really focused on the lived experience knowledge of who's using the service and who's delivering the service as experts in the service of the service. Okay, so the issue I was finding as the random researcher on this project was that this program, the maternity service program, was kind of this really awesome bubble for First Nations families. So we did have an amazing partnership, and the service is still going, expanding across Southeast Queensland. But by and large, and it has had profound impacts on healthcare outcomes. We had a reduction in preterm birth by half in 4 years. So that's an equivalent of 25 babies not born premature, which has huge flow-on effects. But it was just in the maternity section in this program, and the learnings from that program were not translating into the hospital. And so we had this great partnership with community organisations, and we're kind of bringing the service out into the community and not the hospital, but no one was keeping the hospital accountable to the rest of the stuff happening in the hospital that meant that we had to have the specialist service in the first place. And I could talk a lot about that. There was a very, I would say, kind of simplistic way that people were saying racism at the hospital is because there are bad people in the hospital. And there were certainly some people that were acting as gateholders that were causing issues, but it was a simplistic dichotomy, because what we don't capture in that is that everyday work causes disadvantage and oppression. How do I put it? Systematic oppression and disadvantage. So it's not about being a good person. You could have the best intentions, but all this stuff is happening that's kind of controlling the way that you actually have those everyday interactions with the staff member. And in terms of accountability, working Aboriginal community control sector, the mandate's really clear. You're working for and with community. In the hospital, certainly in a governance perspective, as an employee of the hospital, I see people and patients are not who the institution becomes accountable to, and that's problematic. Acknowledging the vast different ways of knowings that are happening in this space, Indigenous knowledge, lived experience knowledges, biomedical, clinical, sociological, etc. And seeing kind of like this hierarchy of knowledges play out in real life. And the biggest issue was with regards to the hospital, so I'm not talking about maternity service anymore, was this urgent need for change at the hospital with regards to improving care for First Nations families, but nothing is changing. And oh yeah, so with that, there's like an acknowledgement that embedding consumers in governance is a great way to kind of fix these things, or at least, shed some light on the issues of the institution. And it works really, really well when it's done well. It can be hard to do. By hard, I mean challenging for the consumer reps, and also staff that really have never been exposed to doing this kind of stuff, but also juggling these competing knowledge systems and pressures and that sort of stuff. And to be quite frank, it is often just simply not done well. And so this kind of led me to, when we're talking about consumer reps in hospital governance, so consumer representatives are people who are explicitly not hospital staff, who have a lived experience of healthcare and who are specifically put on to represent groups of people and their interests, often with no resources to do so. And that's really kind of like, it can quite often lead to tokenistic representation, extractive knowledge, and so Marie Betsy's from Canada, in her decolonizing education and kind of the tokenism in changing or indigenizing a curriculum, that can sometimes you chuck one person in and you add and stir and hope for the best, and really that just doesn't cut it. That's a different approach to having a fundamental commitment to changing how these institutions operate. Okay, so specifically, there was an opportunity that I saw with the new healthcare standards, so the way that hospitals become accredited, and they specifically had a standard about community engagement. So what I was really interested to find out was, how can this be done in practice? So today I won't be presenting the findings from that, but I do have slides hidden if you want to ask me in the questions. So I really want to talk about the methods. So institutional ethnography was kind of come up from the women's movement. So first wave feminism kind of scholars. So Dorothy Smith from Canada kind of created what she has called an alternate sociologist, alternate sociology. And the key points that it's acknowledging the everyday stuff that is controlling and disorganizing our lives, regardless of our intent, and acknowledging that we're all connected in this, institution is not like a hospital or, the tax office. We're all kind of connected in these really messy relationships, and everything is problematic. That's the starting point. And so what I appreciate with this, to draw parallels with, you guys might remember on Q&A, the late Arnie, Rosalie Quinn of Monk said, you know, I am not the problem as an Indigenous person. The institutions are the problem, and this is kind of what institutional ethnography is playing with. So it aims to generate useful knowledge for people to make concrete change. And what's maybe a bit different to the previous speakers is it's critical, it makes you consciously be critical of ideas, ideologies and theories and not take them for granted, because embedded with that is problematic assumptions and people have different interpretations of those ideas. And importantly, ideas don't do things, people do. So does that make sense? Like racism doesn't do this, it's people doing stuff that results in things that people say is racism. So what that means is it's both a burden and a relief, because it means that we do things, but we can also change them. Anyway, I have to really go quickly because I've talked too much. So I probably won't get into PIE, but to leave you with three useful analytical concepts from institutional ethnography that you can kind of use or just think about in your everyday work. One is a general definition of work. So people might think work, I work as a researcher, I do research. But if you go into the minutiae, work is also me getting to work, catching a bus, talking to someone at work, being on the phone with someone who's crying because of work. And it's all that hidden stuff that's happening that usually doesn't get measured, doesn't get counted, doesn't get valued. And so that can be like simple, like making sense and filling out forms. Like forms are not done for people, they're done for institutions. And there's a lot of information in what we find important and what we extract, and how we create forms and use forms that can be useful. Another one is mapping. Susan Turner from Canada, she's got a fab website too if you want to have a look. She kind of brought together this idea of text and action sequences. So you start with an issue. It's specifically, you can't see it because you see how complicated maps can be. But you kind of have, say, I think her original PhD work was, she went walking in ravines, like beautiful countryside, mountainy terrains in her hometown. They wanted to demolish them for development. So she went to a town council meeting and wanted to change it because it was community consultation. And she realized all the work that happens behind the scene that really meant that like you have zero input in actually making any change. So you're mapping the different policy documents that the council members are bringing in, and you're really taking for granted that just because a policy about it doesn't mean everyone interprets the policy right, and you can have these kind of if this then that reaction. Plenty of other great examples of this. And lastly is the one of ideological circles. So back to the comment of being careful with ideas. They can be dehumanizing. They can also obscure the real problem. So a fabulous example is Jean-Louis Thibault. And he was in a workplace as a public servant. The building did a renovation. He could no longer open the window in his building, in his office, and which apparently 20% of people have problems with closed circuit air conditioning, like this room. And like he literally couldn't do his work because of this reason. And then all of a sudden he went down this administrative spiral of bullshit about how he got classed as a disability worker, and to open that he couldn't open the window, they couldn't accommodate him, which they had to do for policy. He had to work from home for 5 years. But the way that he does it, he links how the simple action of opening a window becomes, seen as an environmental sensibility, which is part of a diagnosis for some clinical, and you sort of get caught in this like never-ending cycle of just open the damn window. And when you work in healthcare, you can really relate to some of these things. Yeah, and so the idea of participatory institutional ethnography, Naomi Nichols also in Canada has done a lot of youth work across lots of different institutions. It's really about getting the people, it's bringing the both worlds of the PAR and the IE together, bringing the people that can make change, giving them those tools, those analytic tools to problematize the institutional processes and start seeing, you know, where are the levers that we can change? What are the things that we do have available to us to make this change? And then doing the actual change. And that's probably enough. Oh yeah, so if this interests you, feel free to get in touch with me and or the Australasian IE network, which I co-founded with Nerida. It's a really informal group and we're really fun, so totes just get in touch.